in buying a home. By the time, I think it's by the time we hit 2003, anybody want to guess what the median first-time home buyer was putting down as a percentage? Zero. Okay? So what happened to home equity? You can take a good guess from looking at these numbers. So, bottom line, what have I got now? Income composition shifted over this time period. Savings went down. This is over the long arc of this one generation. And debt increased. I take all these to say that families, middle-class families, because we're mostly dealing at the median here, medians and sometimes averages, because that's what we've got to do with the data, made families more vulnerable economically. So these three things are going on simultaneously in this time period. Now, something else happened at the same time, and that is the rules of the game changed. The laws governing borrowing changed for American consumers. And so I just want to talk about this so you kind of get the long arc of how this works. There's sort of three time periods in consumer credit. The first time period is 14th century BC Code of Hammurabi to 1980. It's a very long time period. But I'm really serious about it. The reason I want you to think about this is if I have any good biblical scholars in the audience, you'll know what I'm talking about, and that's usury. That there were usury laws. There were usury laws back in the Code of Hammurabi. They're scattered all the way throughout the Bible. They first appear in Deuteronomy in talking about usury. And usury, as we know, it's a cap on how much it is that someone can charge when they're lending money. There are lots of different ways it's worked. There have been usury laws in consumer context, but not in business context, sometimes in all contexts. A lot of variations on it. But the bottom line was that usury laws had one important impact, and that was however you built your business model, you're going to bump into a cap, especially if the usury model was pretty low. Now, it's not to say usury models were great. They had some real problems. For example, many usury laws were written, for example, in the state of Arkansas, into the state constitution. That becomes a really serious problem in an inflationary period because they had pegged the number at 10% at a time when we were running inflation at about 14.5%. And you can really cut off credit in a hurry and create some terrible problems in your economy. So it's not to say that usury was perfect, but the point is, it was the first consumer protection. That's what it was there for. It was designed to be a form of consumer protection, and it had a real impact on how consumer credit products were designed, because they were designed around the notion. There wasn't point in being very complicated about it because you'd bump your head, however it was calculated, you're going to bump your head into this usury cap. Now, for a whole bunch of reasons that we could talk about if you wanted to do a whole law lecture on it, what happened in 1980 is that 1979 and 1980, there are kind of two different parts in the law, but in many ways, the effectiveness of the usury laws were sharply undercut. It happens first at the consumer credit with credit cards. It then happens with home mortgages. And so we moved to a different model of how to deal, how to regulate consumer credit. And the model is one, I say two things about it. I use the word tangled because I think it's the right way to understand what happened in the time period 1980 to 2010. And that is, it was tangled from an authority point of view. We ended up, by the end of this period, with 19 federal statutes that have bits and pieces of consumer credit law, not usury, but just other pieces, Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, Fair Credit Reporting Act, Truth in Lending, lots and lots of different pieces, but scattered across 19 statutes, and enforcement of those laws and rule writing around those laws was scattered among 7 different federal agencies. So you end up with this overlay, very complicated set of statutes and very complicated and diffuse and sometimes overlapping, in better parts, sometimes leaving gaps between regulatory model. The second part about what happens in this time period, about how the model begins to shift, is that when we're back in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, most lending, I certainly don't want to say all, but most of what you and I would think of as ordinary banking services, cashing checks, taking out a home mortgage, borrowing money in order to buy a car, taking out a credit card, all of those services are pretty much in banks or credit unions, which means they are with organizations that are either federally chartered or state chartered, somewhere in a fairly heavily regulated system. What starts to grow in this time period are what are called the non-bank lenders. So what we start to see the rise of as you go in the 80s and on into the 90s are payday lenders, for example, check cashers. By the time we hit the 2000s, big time mortgage brokers. Folks who are providing services that in one form or another, payday loans, for example, small dollar loans, had often been done somewhere else in a much more regulated environment, are now done what I call non-bank institutions. The reason I call them non-bank is they're not regulated because they don't use deposits to fund themselves. They basically go straight to investors. So they get their money directly from investors, and that means they're not under the ordinary control of the FDIC or under the ordinary control of the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency or the state banking regulator, whoever it is, and instead are engaging in lending practices, but outside that scheme. The reason this is relevant is it means banks, the regular financial institutions that you're used to seeing, are now competing with a much more lightly regulated financial services industry. And a financial services industry that pays, quite frankly, a much lower regulatory freight. They don't have to sit for supervisory examinations in the same way. So the cost structure, the profitability, the business model is different. So what we end up with is we end up with a system. It's got tangled authority at the federal level. It's a very unbalanced system at the federal level. If you will reorganize yourself as a non-bank financial institution, you'll suddenly be in a different regulatory scheme. It's got, I'll throw in one more, the possibility of regulatory arbitrage. If you don't like how you're being treated by your federal regulator, you can recharter to be a state-regulated institution. If you don't like how you're being treated by your state-chartered institution, you can decide to reorganize as a thrift. So there were lots of options, and all of the regulators knew it. And because the regulators raised their funds from those financial institutions, this had some fairly significant effects in regulatory oversight. The other part is that we used in this tangled model a disclosure model that, frankly, I don't know how else to describe it except we just kept layering on disclose more. I grew up at a time when disclosure was actually a good word. Before it came to mean word barf. Lots and lots of words put out there, and somewhere in there, if you were a lawyer and really could understand it as a result, it would just be easier if you paid cash. And so this became much of the method was we just keep throwing this stuff in, and lost a lawsuit somewhere if you're and I want to be fair to the banks on this. Lost a lawsuit, I'll put some more words in there. Federal Congress hears about some bad thing. Let's just get out there and fry up another law to tell people to disclose this thing. The regulators receive some complaints, they put in some more. And so you end up just kind of layering in and layering in and layering in. So that, for example, a credit card agreement in 1980, that's a page and a half long, grows to more than 30 pages by the time you hit the mid-2000s, 2005, 2008. And what do those 30 pages scream? They scream, don't read me. This could hurt your eyes if you try to read this. So, what happens over this period of time? One more little piece I want to put in here is the products themselves start to shift. You're not surprised. You change the legal rules. At the start of this, we're in a highly inflationary period. And what happens? The product itself starts to morph. So, usury caps are gone. We're in this kind of complicated disclosure. We're in a world in which you have very unlevel playing fields. You've got places